How can the pronunciation of a single word determine whether someone lives or dies? In October of 1937, along the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, thousands of people were killed over the course of just a few days, not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were believed to be. This was not a battle, and it was not a riot that spiraled out of control, but a coordinated campaign of violence in which identity itself became a death sentence. The event would later become known as the Parsley Massacre. To understand how something like this could happen, it is necessary to look at the island where it took place and the long history that shaped the relationship between the two nations that share it. Hispaniola had been divided for centuries, with Haiti occupying the western third and the Dominican Republic the eastern two-thirds. But the division was not simply geographical. The two sides developed under different colonial powers, with the French establishing a plantation economy in the west that relied heavily on enslaved African labour, while the Spanish presence in the east produced a more mixed society, where European, African and indigenous influences blended over time, creating differences that would later be sharpened rather than softened. When Haiti gained independence in 1804 after a successful slave revolt, it marked a turning point not only for the island but for the wider world. Yet that independence came at a cost. Haiti was isolated diplomatically and economically, burdened with debt and prevented from developing on equal terms with other nations, while the eastern side of the island experienced its own cycles of control, including periods under Haitian rule that left a lasting and often resented imprint on Dominican identity and politics. By the early 20th century, tensions between the two sides of the island had not disappeared, but in many ways daily life along the border told a different story. Communities were intertwined, families crossed from one side to the other, and it was not uncommon for people to speak both Spanish and Haitian Creole, reflecting a shared space that did not always align with political boundaries, and one that would soon be forced into a far more rigid and dangerous definition. That fragile coexistence would come under increasing pressure with the rise of Rafael Trujillo. Trujillo came to power in 1930 and quickly established a dictatorship built on control, surveillance, and the careful construction of a national identity that could be both enforced and defended. At its core was the idea that the Dominican Republic was culturally and racially distinct from Haiti, an idea that had existed before, but which under his rule became more rigid, more deliberate, and far more consequential. What had once been a set of historical and cultural differences was gradually reshaped into something sharper, something that could define who belonged and who did not. Over time, this rhetoric began to move beyond words and into policy, particularly in the border regions where migration, labour and land use became increasingly politicised. Efforts were made to restrict the movement of Haitians into the Dominican Republic, but these measures were only partially successful, in part because Haitian labour remained essential to sectors such as agriculture. The border, however, remained porous, and the reality on the ground continued to resist the simplicity of the narrative being promoted from the capital, creating a growing tension between the world as it was being described and the one that actually existed. In early October 1937, that tension gave way to action. The precise details of how the order was given are still debated, but what followed is not. Dominican soldiers, along with local militias, were deployed to the border with instructions to identify and eliminate Haitians living within Dominican territory. Because the populations along the border were so closely connected, identifying who was Haitian and who was Dominican was not always straightforward. Skin colour alone was not a reliable indicator, nor was language in many cases, as bilingualism was common. What emerged instead was a crude and deeply arbitrary method of identification. Suspected individuals were shown a sprig of parsley and asked to name it in Spanish. The word perejil contains a rolled R, a sound that does not exist in the same way in Haitian Creole. Those who could not pronounce it in the expected manner were marked as Haitian. For many, that moment was the last they would experience. Those identified, or even merely suspected, were taken from their homes and led away to isolated areas, often within sight of the communities they had lived in for years. There they were killed, most often with machetes. The methods used during the massacre were not random but deliberate. While firearms were used at times, the reliance on close weapons allowed the violence to be presented as the work of civilians rather than the military, obscuring the role of the state. The killings did not take place in a single location, but unfolded across the border region, moving from village to village and affecting communities that had existed for generations. Men, women, and children were all targeted, and in many cases entire families disappeared without record, leaving behind homes that would never be returned to. Bodies were disposed of in rivers and ravines, including the Massacre River, where the current carried them away and further concealed the scale of what had taken place. Survivors later described people being cut down where they stood, or taken away in small groups and killed out of sight, their bodies left behind or carried off by the river. In some cases, victims were bound before being thrown into the water and left to drown. Some of those had wounds inflicted upon them first in order to attract sharks. Some testimonies go further, describing acts of extreme brutality, including reports of babies being thrown into the air and killed on soldiers' bayonets, and children having their legs cut off so they couldn't run from the bullets. These accounts are difficult to verify in every detail, but they reflect the level of depravity described by those who survived. The violence did not distinguish between age or circumstance. Many of those killed had lived in the region their entire lives. What emerges from the accounts that do exist is not a single method, but a pattern of sustained close-range violence carried out over several days, in which the victims had little chance to escape once they were identified. In the aftermath, the Dominican government sought to distance itself from responsibility, presenting the killings as spontaneous acts carried out by local farmers defending their land. However, the scale, coordination, and timing of the violence point strongly to state involvement, and historians widely regard the massacre as having been directed from above. Estimates of how many people were killed vary widely, and that uncertainty is part of the story itself. Most historians place the number somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000, although some contemporary reports suggested figures as low as 4,000. What is clear is not the exact number, but the scale, which was vast enough to empty entire communities along the border in a matter of days. International reactions followed, and under pressure, the Dominican government agreed to pay compensation to Haiti, although much of that money never reached the victims or their families, lost instead to corruption and administrative control. Beyond the immediate loss of life, the massacre had lasting consequences for the relationship between the two nations. It reinforced divisions that had once been more fluid and contributed to the entrenchment of anti-Haitian sentiment within Dominican political and social discourse. It also exposed the dangers of defining identity in rigid and exclusionary terms, particularly in a region where history, culture, and family ties had long crossed the very boundaries that were now being enforced with violence. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of the massacre is how something as minor as the pronunciation of a word came to carry such weight. In a region where people had lived side by side, shared languages, and formed communities across borders, that small linguistic difference was transformed into a tool of separation, and, in October 1937, a tool of death. The Parsley Massacre shows how quickly such differences can be magnified, and how easily they can be used to justify acts that in any other context would seem unthinkable. It also shows that events like this are rarely sudden, but are built over time, shaped by politics, ideology, and the deliberate construction of identity, until a moment arrives when those ideas are no longer just words but actions. And, along a border where people had once lived side by side for generations, those actions left thousands dead. Now, this was a terrible tragedy with a great many people killed, and I feel very, very sorry for the communities that lived side by side on the borders. They seem to be able to get along, but it just shows that when governments decide that they are going to take action, lots of deaths can follow. Despite the tragic nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll say bye-bye for now.